How's it going, everyone? Today we are going to talk a little bit more about the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide through the respiratory system and through the blood. So we're going to discuss a couple of laws when it comes to gases, Dalton's law and Henry's law, and then we'll talk about what affects oxygen and carbon dioxide transport. O2 and CO2 are going to be able to diffuse into the blood by passive diffusion, meaning there's no protein or no transporter needed in order to get oxygen and carbon dioxide from the blood to the lungs or vice versa. But what governs how much oxygen or carbon dioxide actually diffuses through the pulmonary capillaries or the alveoli is going to be dependent upon two laws, and we'll explain them quickly here. That will be Dalton's law and Henry's law. When we have a mixture of gases, the total pressure of that mixture is made up of individual partial pressures. So, for example, we have the air here at sea level, and the total pressure of that air is 760 mmHg. And making up most of that air is nitrogen, and it makes up roughly 79% of that atmospheric air. And so the partial pressure of nitrogen is roughly 79% of the total pressure. And oxygen is the second most abundant gas, and it makes up roughly 21%. So the partial pressure is going to be roughly 21% of atmospheric pressure. So each individual gas is going to have its own partial pressure, and when you have the mixture of those gases, each individual partial pressure is summated to make up the entire pressure. We are going to be able to transport a certain amount of oxygen and a certain amount of CO2 throughout the bloodstream. And Henry's law tells us that the quantity of gas that will dissolve within the liquid is proportional to the partial pressure of the gas and its solubility. So the problem for us is, however, that oxygen can be transported in the plasma, but very, very low amounts, because oxygen is not that soluble. But luckily, we have these red blood cells, these erythrocytes, the hemoglobin, in order for oxygen to be transported throughout our bloodstream. CO2 has a little bit higher solubility, but most of the CO2, the carbon dioxide that's transported throughout the bloodstream, will be transported as bicarbonate. So when we talk about exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide, this happens at two different places. It happens at the lungs, which we call pulmonary gas exchange. And what's going to happen is that as we inhale that air in, that oxygen that comes into our system is going to diffuse across the alveoli and into the pulmonary capillaries. And at the same time, what's happening at the pulmonary circulation is that carbon dioxide is diffusing across the capillaries into the alveoli, and that's what we exhale out. This same or similar exchange happens at the rest of the cells in our body as well. So as oxygenated arterial blood is transported to specific organs and cells, O2 is going to be dumped off from those hemoglobin, and CO2 that is made or is a byproduct of the metabolic actions of those cells, they're going to exchange again. So this time O2 is going from the bloodstream, diffusing across the capillary into the cell, and CO2 is diffusing across into the blood. Here we can see the partial pressures of O2 and CO2 throughout the body. First, let's notice that the atmospheric air that we breathe in is made up of, again, nitrogen, but the two gases that we're concerned about is oxygen and carbon dioxide. And within that air, 21% roughly is the partial pressure of O2. So that partial pressure is equal to 159 mmHg, while CO2 in the atmospheric air is very low. So what happens is we take in that air, and we do lose some of the pressure of that oxygen, and that's due to the fact that we have higher concentrations of CO2 within our lungs. Also, I explained this in my upper level cardiovascular, cardiopulmonary courses, but also the humidification of the air Some of that water vapor is going to lower the partial pressure of O2 as well. But here in the concentration of the lungs, we could see that alveolar air is going to have a partial pressure of 105 mmHg for O2, and then a partial pressure of 40 mmHg for CO2. I want you to remember, again, even though we're talking about individual gases, the movement and the exchange of gases is going to be based off pressure differences, pressure gradients. And so we have deoxygenated blood that has a lower concentration of O2 and a higher concentration of CO2, and that's going to make its way to the lungs. And since the mmHg, the partial pressure of O2 here is 105, and the PO2 here is 40, that's going to drive the movement of O2 from the alveoli into the pulmonary capillaries. And since carbon dioxide is greater, the partial pressure is greater in that venous blood than in the lungs, well, that's going to drive the movement of CO2 from the venous blood to the lungs. And that's how we exhale out CO2 and how we take in O2 from our respiratory pathways. And then that arterial blood has a higher concentration of higher partial pressure of oxygen. And then when it makes its way down to the cells, notice that the pressure of O2 at the cells is really low. And why is that? Well, they are metabolically active. So they're using that oxygen. There's not that high of a concentration of oxygen around these cells. And so once this arterial blood makes its way down to those cells, we're going to see a similar exchange happen just in the opposite direction. O2 is now going to go from the higher partial pressure in the arterial blood to the lower partial pressure in the systemic tissues. And the buildup of CO2 through metabolism is going to create a higher partial pressure of CO2 within these tissues, which drives the movement into the blood in the systemic capillaries. All right, I blew this up a little bit, but let's talk about how each of these gases are transported. When we talk about the transportation of CO2, 7% of it in our bodies is transported throughout the actual blood plasma. So it is able to diffuse into this blood pathway, and it's soluble enough where some of that carbon dioxide, not a lot of it, but some of it does get just transported throughout that blood plasma. 23% is going to attach itself to hemoglobin. So 7% in the plasma, around a quarter of what's being transported in the blood just directly attaches to hemoglobin. And then 70%, most of the carbon dioxide transportation in our bloodstream occurs through bicarbonate. And we talked about bicarbonate in the blood lecture, but basically the CO2 and H2O are going to undergo a reaction through carbonic anhydrase that'll convert it to bicarbonate, and the excess hydrogen will attach itself to the hemoglobin, and then that bicarbonate travels throughout the bloodstream to the lungs, and then once we make our way back to the lungs, that bicarbonate makes its way back to being CO2 and H2O, and that's how we exhale it out. So O2, only 1.5%, 1% roughly, is in the plasma. And so not a lot of oxygen is being transported in the actual liquid of the blood itself. Mostly all of it, 98.5, 99% of the oxygen that we transport is going to attach itself to the hemoglobin of red blood cells. And then once that blood gets to an area where there's a low amount of O2, because these tissues, these cells are using O2, so the concentration will be lower. That is going to drive the transport and the exchange of oxygen from the blood to those working cells. Again, oxygen has very low solubility within our blood plasma, and that is why we need these erythrocytes, these red blood cells, to help transport oxygen. So when those red blood cells, the hemoglobin within those red blood cells are attached to oxygen, we call that oxyhemoglobin. And when they are not attached we call that deoxyhemoglobin. The relationship between the partial pressure of oxygen and the percentage of hemoglobin in the blood that are bound to oxygen is expressed through this graph right here. And this is called the oxyhemoglobin disassociation curve. And we could see that as we increase the partial pressure of O2 in the environment, more oxygen is going to bind to hemoglobin until we reach this level of saturation. This is going to describe the relationship of how oxygen is bound to hemoglobin in certain environments. So if we look at a highly oxygenated area of the body, the lungs, we're going to see high partial pressures of O2. And that's why when the blood makes its way to the lungs, that oxygen will diffuse across the alveoli, and we're going to get a majority of those red blood cells bound to oxygen. And that's why if you've ever had a clip that tells you your oxygen saturation, your blood oxygen levels, you are going to see numbers like 97 or above, meaning that 97% of those erythrocytes are bound to oxygen. And so not only does this tells us the relationship in high oxygen environments, but it also gives us an idea of what's going to happen in lower oxygen environments. And so as that arterial blood makes its way to an area of the body, let's say like the cells, let's say like skeletal muscle cells, well, the PO2 at those cells are going to be lower. So the oxygen that is bound to hemoglobin, well, that's going to go from a place of higher concentration to a place of lower concentration. So what you're seeing in this curve are that oxygen being dumped off as they go through the systemic circulation. And if we're in a condition, let's say like exercise, where there is a lot of oxygen being used at those cells, well, that's going to decrease the PO2 and that area. And so when arterial blood makes its way to those contracting muscles, we're going to have an even greater dump off, a greater disassociation of O2 from hemoglobin. And so this is just expressing how oxygen binds to hemoglobin based on the amount of oxygen, the partial pressure of oxygen in that environment. We're going to see that the amount of hemoglobin attached to oxygen is also dependent upon other factors besides the partial pressure of O2, including acidity or pH of the blood, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, temperature, and biphosphoglycerate. And so when we look at the normal oxygen disassociation curve here, and then manipulate pH, we're going to see that more acidic environments, higher concentrations of hydrogen ions in the blood, okay, higher acidity, lower pH, is going to mean that less hemoglobin is bound to oxygen, and then the reverse for higher pHs. For carbon dioxide, the greater the concentration of carbon dioxide, the less oxygen that's bound to hemoglobin. And these two effects right here are called the Bohr effect. And so when you have an increased number of hydrogen ions or an increased number of CO2 in that environment, what it's going to do is kick off the oxygen from hemoglobin, or more oxygen gets dumped off. And this is not necessarily a bad thing. Let's put it into context. Let's think about exercise. An environment where skeletal muscles are contracting, which help to release greater amounts of hydrogen ions, lower pHs, and also a greater amount of carbon dioxide is being produced. And so when arterial blood makes its way to these working and active skeletal muscles, and there's more hydrogen ions and there's more CO2, what that's going to mean is that during exercise, more oxygen will disassociate from those red blood cells, which is what we want. So it's advantageous that during exercise, these events occur and these things are happening because it's going to lead to more oxygen dump off from those red blood cells. A similar thing happens with higher temperatures, and again, relating it back to exercise, this is also going to promote a dump off of oxygen at skeletal muscle fibers when higher temperatures are being produced. And you think about exercise, hydrogen's increasing, carbon dioxide's increasing, temperature is increasing. And then we also have a fourth factor called biphosphoglycerate, which also leads to more oxygen dump off when there's a increased concentration of biphosphoglycerate. And biphosphoglycerate is just a byproduct of glycolysis. And so as we're exercising, let's say, and we're undergoing more glycolysis in those skeletal muscle fibers and more BPGs being produced, again, it leads to more disassociation of oxygen from hemoglobin, and that oxygen ultimately winds up in our skeletal muscle cells, and that can be used for metabolism, and that helps to drive the ATP demand, the energy demand while we are exercising. Last, I just want to show one more time how we will manage CO2. And so in the systemic circulation, what happens is as O2 gets dumped off from the hemoglobin, then CO2 is going to make its way, some into the plasma, some will directly bind to this hemoglobin, and then again, most of that exchange is going to be bicarbonate, which carbonic anhydrase converts CO2 and H2O into carbonic acid to be then bicarbonate and hydrogen. And the bicarbonate then leaves the red blood cell and then will travel all the way up to the lungs, in which then the reverse reaction takes place. This bicarbonate is going to jump right back onto the red blood cell, combine back with that hydrogen to make carbonic acid. This enzyme will then split that apart to CO2 and H2O. That diffuses into the lungs, and that's what's exhaled. You also may see this chloride shift here on this figure, and if you're asking where does that take role, like what is the purpose of that? Well, when we convert CO2 and H2O to carbonic acid and then it splits apart, bicarbonate leaves. And so along with it, it takes a negative charge. And this hydrogen is going to basically stick around onto the hemoglobin. And we don't want a change in charge because of this. And so in order to balance out the positive charge of this hydrogen ion, a negative chloride ion is going to also bind to the erythrocyte, the red blood cell. And what that ensures is that there's no change in charge when these reactions are occurring. And so that's it. A relatively shorter lecture, but we discussed all about gases and how they're transported throughout the body, mainly O2 and CO2. We discussed that each gas that makes up a mixture of gases is going to make up its partial pressure that is relative to the concentration of that gas. So we talked about the atmospheric air and how nitrogen's roughly 79% and oxygen's 21%. And those partial pressures are going to be equal to roughly 79% and roughly 21% of the total pressure. And then we just talked about how oxygen and CO2 is transported, oxygen mainly through red blood cells, erythrocytes, carbon dioxide through bicarbonate, carboxyhemoglobin, that's when carbon dioxide actually binds to the hemoglobin, and then through the plasma. In addition, we also talked about what is going to promote the diffusion of oxygen and the diffusion of CO2, and that is going to be the differences in the pressure gradient between the lungs and the blood, between the blood and the cells. And we just also talked about what affects the binding of oxygen to hemoglobin. And so I want you to go back and just review over this whole cardiorespiratory section and understand how we get oxygen into the bodies, how the heart and the vessels work to transport this blood and all these materials, and then how do we use those blood gases and how do we transport those blood gases in order to maintain homeostasis. Thank you guys so much, and I will see you next lecture.